So, welcome to this video. In this video I want to explore a concept that I unpack a little bit in the book as well, which is maybe a little bit controversial, but maybe really relevant. So, the idea is was Jesus the prophet of the time? So, circa 0. Or was there another prophet that was actually there at this time, and that is indicated to us through the scriptures? So where does this idea come from? But first of all, we know that we're dealing with the same tradition. Once we understand the rebirthing, then we understand that the tradition when we're talking about the virgin birth. So Jesus in the New Testament, disclaimer, I'm not a scholar whatsoever in any New Testament stuff. I just read the odd bits and bobs here and there, and that's it really. So, but having experienced the rebirth, what we understand is that the text, the scriptures, tells us that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mother. So what that tells us is that Jesus, in his awakening, in his apprenticeship to becoming the sage, the saint, the Christ that he was, he went through this experience of the virgin birth, and this experience is this experience of pushing through the hymen layer, this energetic membrane that we need to push through as the energy comes down, instead of having energy raising up to the third eye through the opening of the chakra system and all that, and then energy going out or some other way. In the rebirthing, the energy comes down the system, and as that happens, we have this sensation of pushing through an energetic membrane, which is experienced in what one can only imagine is the same way as what a baby would experience if it was pushing out of the vagina of a virgin. So if there was no penetration, if the hymen layer was never broken, then a baby who was seeded inside a womb without any penetration into a virgin who'd never had any penetration, then there would still be this hymen layer intact, which is normally broken on penetration, wouldn't have been broken. So the baby coming out would have to push through this hymen layer. So this is the virgin birth that one can experience through rebirthing, that one does experience through rebirthing. So when we see that in the Bible, we know that we are talking about this tradition once one understands what the rebirthing teaching is all about. If we're still not sure whether we're dealing with the same teaching, also remember that Jesus goes into the desert and he disappears for 40 days and 40 nights. We don't know exactly what that's all about. We know that there's an idea that he went off into the desert, possibly with the Essenes, and that's when essentially he learnt his practice, where he evolved into the Christ, into a Buddha. So 40 days and 40 nights. A day is 12 hours and a night is also 12 hours, or 40 days and 40 nights together equals 40 times 24, and 40 times 24 equals, I think, 960. So once again, that reminds us that we're working with the 9, 6 and 0. So same tradition. Just get rid of that. However, there's also another story, another element of the story from the New Testament, where we're told that Mary has a virgin birth. Mary has the virgin birth. Now, as a practitioner, the felt sense of going through the rebirthing is that I have the virgin birth. So if Mary has the virgin birth and then gives birth to Jesus, to the Christ, or gives birth, I mean, initially, if I have the virgin birth, I feel like it's me, Richard, who's having the virgin birth, and then that is the déclencheur. That is the momentum. That's what takes me into this spiritual tradition of rebirthing, where that is going to become my practice and transform in many ways the way I am in the world. So that is giving birth to the Christ for me. So initially one has this experience. We come into this 1080 HD vision, sense of being in the world, and that is the birth of something, a perception that there's another way of being in this world, in a more awakened, alert state of being, in a more open-hearted way, and that is the birth of the Christ. Then Jesus goes off and he does his studies with the Essenes. Then he gathers his apostles, etc., etc. And finally, at the end, Jesus is on the cross. Now, Jesus on the cross, again, talked about quite a bit in the book. Jesus on the cross is Jesus in the center of his being. Jesus is in the center of his sphere. He's awake at this point. And then at some point Jesus dies on the cross. Now, witnessing this is Mary. Not only is it Mary the mother, but it's also Mary Magdalene. And so my theory here is, my theory is that Mary is the prophet. Now, was that Mary the mother, or was that Mary Magdalene? Or is it that Mary the mother, the one who gave birth to Jesus, she was Mary Magdalene? She experienced this new way of being in the world through the rebirthing, and then the process of perfecting that was her apprenticeship, and Mary becomes Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, the name is possibly coming from Magdala, which is one of the coastal towns which was famous apparently for having a tower in the town. So when we talk about the tower, the inner tower is the chakra column. So Mary may have become famous for being the Mary of the tower, the Mary of the inner tower. So was Mary of Nazareth transforming into Mary Magdala, or Mary Magdalene as she became known? And also, it's also interesting that Mary Magdalene, she's like the apostle of the apostles. I believe that's officially her title, given from the Pope in some recent time. But she's the apostle. She's not one of the 12 apostles, and yet she is there at the side of Jesus all the time. She's the one who seems the most intimate, the most connected with him, and possibly the one potentially who understands his teachings better than anyone. Now, we're back at the crucifixion, and both Mary the mother and Mary Magdalene are there to witness this event. And this is the point where I wonder if this is the moment of transformation where Mary the mother becomes Mary Magdalene. And in terms of witnessing, as a practitioner, at a certain point, Jesus on the cross and Jesus dying, because Jesus is representative here of the ego mind, but being at the center of our being, we're also grounded here in the observer consciousness. And the observer consciousness is the one who witnesses the events. And these events, eventually, we're talking about the death of the ego mind. So it is the ego mind that stops us most of the time from reaching the higher planes, to talk about the 31 planes of existence, the higher planes of presence, of awareness, of consciousness. As we shift into more and more presentness, more and more clarity of mind, as the practice deepens, then at a certain point the ego actually dissolves or relinquishes and dissipates at that time. Now, as the practitioner, I, Richard, am conscious of that process as it unfolds. I'm aware of this slowing down of the ego. I'm aware of this becoming more and more present to the factors, the elements that are within the body sensations, the emotional sensations, the mental activity and movements of the mind, and also conscious of all that is touching on the sense doors, so perched at the sense doors. And at a certain point, the ego mind, which is the grasping, the obsessive thinking about the past, about the future, rolling in fantasies, and this element of me is quietening down and down and down, and at some point it actually dies back. And that is the moment where Jesus dies on the cross. As a practitioner, I am in a space of observer consciousness, and I'm witness to all that, just as Mary the mother, Mary of Nazareth if you like, and Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene, are the witnesses of this process of Jesus dying on the cross. And most of the scriptures seem to agree. There's the different scriptures from the different apostles which are not necessarily completely aligned, but from what I understand, globally it is considered to be the case that Mary Magdalene was there at the crucifixion, and then she was also there at the bringing down of the body and the burial. She was also there at the discovery of the empty tomb, and then she's also the one who is there, the first to see him as the resurrected Christ. So let's run through this. So we've talked about them being there at the crucifix, both Marys, and I'm saying that this is possibly a moment of transition when Mary, the mother, really transforms into Mary Magdalene. So and what happens is the body is brought down, the ego is brought down, it's seen clearly by the observer consciousness, by the witnessing mind, and well, in an ideal sense, it's then buried in some way. It's like we can put that away, because we realize that the vibrancy of life, the vibrancy of living moment to moment, is in that space which is free from ego mind. I'm also really aware that sometimes I channel things into this idea of being free from ego mind, but it's free from ego mind with an open-heartedness, with the great heart knot opened and connected. But we're also talking about different layers of awareness and consciousness, because you have to remember, from the human plane, in the planes of existence teaching, there are 6 planes before we reach the highest plane, plane 11, which is the highest awakened state, the controllers of others' creations. So we're talking about different layers. But at this stage, in terms of the story of Jesus, which I'm debating whether Jesus was the real prophet or was it Mary, but it may also just be a teaching story which was devised and possibly loosely based on historical events, or not at all, or completely historical. But once Mary has been there and witnessed the death of the ego, then it is her that returns and finds the empty tomb. Now this for me is also an alignment to teachings on like emptiness in Zen. It is the understanding that this ego is just a composite of experiences, of mental streams that have been evolved, which we've become attached to. And once we see this dying on the cross, we understand this emptiness, that this ego is actually empty. And this is also a great moment, signpost on the path of progression of insight. And this, in terms of the planes of existence, the coming down off the cross, bringing the energy back down, and then the burial and the empty tomb, we're in the, for people following the book, we're in the Yama plane potentially here, which is the plane of death. So, and this is where everything comes down into, let's say, just presence and awareness. But at this stage, the heart knot hasn't opened yet. Attention is raised to the third eye is opened, energy comes down, and energy rests at the base of the spine again. And then from that moment, there is a potential for the energy to start to rise up again. This is the opening and the rising of Kundalini energy. And when Kundalini energy rises up, the heart knot gets opened up, and the energy rises, and the energy of conscious awareness, which is what we were in, witnessing the death of the ego, and the energy of the universal energy, the manifest element of universal energy, Kundalini energy, rise up, and they meet at the pineal gland, at the third eye, and then this opens us up and takes us into the higher stages of awakened consciousness. So we've been through a rebirthing, and especially with the hymen layer, but after we've done that for a certain period of time, the hymen layer does disappear, and we don't experience that as part of the rebirth. And now we've gone through a rebirthing, we've been witness to the death of the ego, and once again we have to go through the rebirthing to allow the Kundalini to be released. And when the Kundalini comes up, then this is the resurrection of the Christ. This is the Christ in its fullest glory. This is the higher states of awakened mind. We can attain to those states of awakened mind from our day-to-day, or out of our day-to-day states of consciousness. The death of Jesus on the cross doesn't mean that, for most of us at least, doesn't mean that we are finished with the ego is dead and buried, but it is a process in terms of unlocking those higher states of conscious awareness. Now, once we understand these stages of the rebirth experience as that, then we see that the original virgin birth, the Jesus being on the cross, the bringing down of the body and burial, the discovery of the empty tomb, and the resurrection, these are all classic stages of the rebirth experience. And it is the one that witnesses, the one who watches, the observer consciousness, that is the one who is the awakened being. And so in this case, it strikes me as being Mary who has the virgin birth, Mary who witnesses Jesus on the cross, burial, empty tomb resurrection. And it is indeed Mary who goes to the other disciples to inform them of Jesus' resurrection. Now, I mean, just to play with some ideas, I mean, why would this story be hidden? Why would it be Jesus developed as the character? I mean, where is Mary Magdalene, someone who's always at his side? In the Last Supper, we get Jesus and the 12 disciples. Mary Magdalene is not there. Unless, of course, Mary Magdalene is the Christ. But either way, in a highly patriarchal society, maybe the idea of a woman as the saviour, a woman as a saint, a woman as a prophet, a woman as a highly respected religious teacher who was drawing all this attention, all these people towards her at this time, maybe that wasn't so well digestible by the authorities, by the religious authorities at the time, or whatever, or just that it maybe didn't seem, if the Jesus story was created maybe actually to draw some distraction away from the actual core of this teaching, which was the rebirthing, maybe it made sense to make that also a male figurehead. There are also stories that Mary Magdalene was thrown out of Palestine not long after the crucifixion. So maybe that also ties in, if this was a actual historical story, this prophet who was creating maybe some unacceptable situations for the authorities in Palestine at the time, whether that would have been the religious heads of the Jewish community or whether that would have been the Roman authorities, they wanted to get rid of this influence, and maybe instead of crucifying and making them a martyr, which is what would have happened, maybe it's more realistic that they threw her out on a boat without oars, as the story goes, and to die at sea. And it just so happens that, in theory, this story goes that this boat washes up into the Mediterranean and into the south coast of France. Southern France is also where the old Vatican, or the papacy, the original Pope's residence was. And there's Lourdes, which is one of the biggest worship sites of the Virgin, connected to the Virgin Mary. And also the south of France was also where the Cathars, which were a kind of, we're talking much, much later, but is there a possibility that this area kept some purity of the teachings? And the Cathars were wiped out by the ruling class of the time, and they were kind of a esoteric branch of Christianity that evolved in the Occitanie area of France, southern France. And also from what I've read and understood is that in the early church, or the early Christian formation of the religion, the role of the woman was much stronger. There were there were female preachers or leaders of the community, and that would also make more sense if the original figurehead, prophet, teacher was female. Then that would also draw a stronger connection to other women, and it would be more acceptable for have women in more leadership levels, which is also why in the patriarchal society it would be good to knock that one on the head as well. There are also a lot of Marian sects, which I know very little about, but I mean there is a lot of devotion through those sects towards Mary, although what I understand is I think that they are predominantly towards the Mary the Mother, if they are not one and the same as Mary Magdalene. And so, as a understanding of the rebirthing teaching evolves, for me also this understanding that if there is a prophet that came from this time period, if there is a prophet that came from this part of the world at this time, for me the chances are that that particular prophet is more likely to be Mary than Jesus. So, thanks for watching this video.